This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. U.S. producers of products as varied as soybeans and motorcycles are nervously watching as the Trump administration prosecutes an escalating trade war. Tariffs have long figured into American trade policy and were for a long time the federal government's largest source of revenue. To help us place this current round of tit-for-tat tariffs into context and explore the likely impacts, we're joined today by Hamid Mohtadi. Dr. Mohtadi is a widely published professor of economics at UWM, where his research and teaching interests include economic development and trade policy. Dr. Mohtadi, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with just some basics. What is a tariff?
So a tariff basically is a tax on imports. So when you put a tariff, basically, what you're saying is that the price of imported good rises by the amount of tariff. Like, for example, we're talking about 10% tariff up until end of December and going up to 25% and so on. That means that Chinese exports to us will cost that much more to the U.S. consumers. So, it's basically a sort of tax on the import of the products. And the hope is that that'll stimulate production, increase production of domestic goods up to that price level, because now there is an extra marginal profit for domestic producers to make. And so that is the logic of the tariff itself.
So at a more basic level, I think the sort of conventional wisdom for a lot of economic thought is that free markets are ultimately, the market is the most efficient, and so how does it connect to that?
Yeah. So it's a very interesting question. Tariff has been used strategically by not only U.S. in the 19th century in a way of by way of protecting its nascent and infant industries, but also by many Asian economies, Japan in its growth years, Korea, Taiwan, and now certainly many other countries. So the usage of tariff has had less to do with market efficiency. In fact, it takes away from market efficiency. Every economist in an introductory econ course will show you that tariffs are an inefficient instrument. So the way in which tariff has been justified is the idea of protection of either new industries or dying industries or industries that have strategic importance. So there's always been some sort of a non-economic or some sort of a dynamic growth-oriented argument that sometimes developing countries have used, trying to justify the use of tariff protection. Some Latin American countries, for example, in the past have had as high as perhaps 300 or 400% tariff on automobiles in order to stimulate domestic production of automobiles. And so it is not an instrument that has just been used recently. Of course, now that we've moved to this era of globalization and everyone has realized that tariff is a win-win practice where it leads to the increase in the GDP of both exporting and importing countries, and with the help of WTO and so on. So really tariff had become, until very recent past, until President Trump took over, an instrument of the past. And it was widely accepted that it was not a very efficient instrument to use.
Well, if you could walk us through sort of that evolution of GATT and then eventually the WTO. I mean, so the world community, as you say, has really historically been on a trend to try to eliminate or certainly reduce tariffs.
Yes. So GATT was a predecessor to WTO, and GATT stands for General Agreement for Tariffs and Trade and Tariffs, or Tariffs and Trade. And it later was reformed and led to WTO, World Trade Organization. Basically, the idea is that countries multilaterally come to agreements with respect to trading with each other, and the rule of the game basically is that you try, unless there are specific, very justifiable reasons, you try to practice free trade. And then one of the key aspects of WTO, of course, is that it provides it provides the avenue for countries to raise complaints if they have any, so that there's an avenue for that to be thought. And both U.S. and other countries have used that in the past to raise questions about particular issue that, dumping, for example, was in large part of what we used to hear about during the previous administrations, where we felt that China was dumping its products below the market price. So one of those areas where if WTO recognizes that that is in fact factual and justifiable, then it'll allow for the importing countries to sort of quote unquote punish, if you will, the country that is underselling. And so there has been certainly avenues for raising grievances.
So I'd like to read, if I could, a recent quote by Donald Trump with reference to the tariffs on China. He said, this is earlier this month, "China is paying us billions of dollars in tariffs. Treasury is collecting tremendous amounts of money, which is great for our country." So that sounds like a good thing.
Well, it sounds to me it's a direct, it's a highly non-Republican statement. And the reason for that, I say, is because it really is a direct transfer from consumers and producers of products that use higher cost imports to the government. So we have a model in which we've got a transfer in the reverse direction. And so really, in a sense, there are three reasons why tariffs, especially in the way it's been applied under current administration, are hurtful generally and especially harmful to the state of Wisconsin. One is that, of course, tariffs in general raise the prices to consumers, so that consumers as a whole will have to pay a higher price, and there's a loss of consumer welfare. The second is that tariffs, when imposed on products that are used, if you will, the expression, at the top of the supply chain, such as aluminum and steel, where every other industry uses it, raise the costs to all those industries. So industries feel, on the one hand, reduction in consumer demand because prices are higher, on the other hand, increasing costs. And the third effect of tariff is, of course, retaliation, which we now see China and Europe and Canada, well, less Canada, but China and Europe are retaliating against Trump's policies and imposing. So Wisconsin happens to be really a loser on all of those three grounds. We don't have production of aluminum and steel. We use aluminum and steel in many of our industries, so that's one. Our consumers are going to have to pay a higher price. And thirdly, we're one of the biggest exporters of goods and services among American states. So we're going to be losing on that ground as well.
So what about the first part of this Donald Trump statement of China is paying us billions? I mean, tariffs are really not paid for by the country exporting.
That's right. That's the whole point. It's this transfer, basically, of wealth from consumers and producers to the government. The reason, to elaborate on that is, it is true that it's possible that some Chinese exporters will end up exporting less, so there will be some element of that. But by and large, what's going to happen is that our exporters will be, our importers will be, there will be some increase in the probably profitability of aluminum and steel, but beyond that, all other industries are going to be facing higher costs, and consumers will be losing. So those are the transfers that happen from consumers and producers to the government.
So what about something at a different point in the supply chain? Say televisions, which are subject to some tariffs. So if there's a Chinese television manufacturer and there are still Chinese televisions coming into the U.S. market, where is that tariff cost passed on? Who pays it ultimately?
Okay, so let's say that there is a U.S. producer of television. Now, in the old days, we know there were. We don't know. I personally don't. I'm not aware of. So suppose there's a U.S. producer of television, hypothetically. That producer will see a higher price. So that producer itself will gain. Now, television is, because it's sort of like Donald Trump, during President Reagan, the Japanese put a tariff on Harley-Davidson. Because television is a sort of closer to a final consumer product, the effect is somewhat limited to consumers having to pay more for that television station. So therefore, there's a loss of welfare on the part of the consumers. But now imagine, instead of that television, it was an industry which was used by other industries in the economy. In this case, it's going to be aluminum and steel, for example, or let's say whatever it was, tires.
Copper wire that goes into the television.
Exactly. So then you have a situation where while that particular industry might benefit, the benefit of that will have to be weighed against the costs associated with all industries that use that. Now, I think back in July, Peterson Institute, a very well-known international research institute in Washington, D.C., came up with an estimate of looking at these gains and losses. What it found is that for roughly, it estimated that for roughly every 37 tariffs on every $37.5 billion worth of goods will cost, on the net, there will be some gains in that particular industry that's protected and losses broader economy. It'll lead to 79,000 jobs lost. Now, we imagine that the amount of the tariffs on goods and services we're talking about now are far greater than $37.5 billion worth of goods and services. So if you multiply that by, say, a factor of 5 or 6, that would be the net loss in jobs, i.e. the contraction of all the industries that in this case would be using, would be either facing higher prices and therefore consumers aren't buying as much, or higher costs because factors of production have increased, or both.
So what is the administration's justification for the tariffs then? If it's a net job loss, why is this a good thing?
So actually, I think that's an excellent point, an excellent question. And here's what I think is happening. I don't think that the administration, including Mr. Trump, do understand that this really is a bargaining position. This is a way in which you can try to stare down, if you will, your opponent. And I understand that, at least in our own state, many Wisconsin farmers still, despite all the, farm sector will be one of the big losers of all this. But despite that, many farmers are willing to, endure the pain in order to reap the benefits. And what are the benefits? The benefits that Mr. Trump hopes is that other countries, China, Canada, Europe, elsewhere, will finally blink before we do, and they will negotiate trade deals with us that are more acceptable to our terms. So, and the difficulty with that position is that today, because of the growth of countries like China and Asia and so on, today's U.S. is not U.S. of 30, 40 years ago in terms of its relative economic might. While it was possible for Ronald Reagan to stare down the Japanese with respect to the little trade back and forth we had with them, it's going to be much more difficult to stare down the Chinese, because certainly they are holding $1 trillion of our bonds. They have a lot of bargaining power, just as much as we have over them, they have over us, if not more. And so consequently, there is a fair amount of risk that the tariff, if you will, the tariff bargain or the tariff position that we take as a bargaining position may in fact not work as a sort of a starting point to bargain, if you will. So.
Well, without getting too far into the economic weeds, there's also an argument that if trade with China contracts and China has fewer dollars, they would be less likely to be buying U.S. dollar-denominated debt. And so that could have an effect on U.S. interest rates. Is that a reasonable argument?
Well, so if China begins to buy less U.S. debt, the price of U.S. debt will decline. What's going to happen is that our interest rates as a consequence will rise. So not only rise because of what the Federal Reserve does, but in fact will rise in the marketplace. And of course, we all know, again, one of those first lessons of macroeconomics that we learned is an increase in interest rates is a damper on the economy. We know that Mr. Volcker used that effectively to cool down spiraling inflation back in the 1980s. So here we're going to have a situation not only that we're going to have, if in fact this tariff war doesn't end in a good way, we're going to end up with higher prices because of the increased cost of imports. We're going to have some contraction of production because of factors that we talked about. And we would have the monetary channel that would also raise interest rates. So we have all of these things sort of, because the world is a much more integrated world today than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
So we talked a little bit about the WTO and sort of dispute resolution mechanisms within it. And a lot of these unilateral tariffs that the administration is putting on would seem to be beyond the bounds of what's acceptable. So it has been couched in terms of one sort of escape clause, if you will, for a lot of the WTO, and that's national security.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, you know, I really don't have a lot to add in that you're absolutely correct, in that you cannot defend our position vis-a-vis WTO directly. And so the only way we could defend our position would be through national security.
So the idea
arguments.
being that you know, every country has a right to see to its own security, and if certain exports are so critical, then
that's right.
You can go outside of the agreement.
Well, and this is precisely one of the fears that many economists have about the weakening of the structure of WTO. WTO really has been a very important pillar in the creation of this global trading system. And if countries begin to use arguments like national security argument to move out of WTO, to find a way out of the WTO structure, then you would have the problem, the fear that many economists have, and that would be the fear of a trade war, where everyone begins to put tariff on everyone else's. And of course, we all know too well, if we know a little bit about economic history, how really, in a sense, certainly World War II, prior to World War II, we had a fair amount of trade war between countries, and economists have argued that that was part of the impetus to the beginning of, you know.
So that brings to mind a name that many people may have heard of and maybe not have a clear sense of, and that's the Smoot-Hawley legislation of the 1930s, which was very protectionist, and so I think it's most economists would agree it was certainly not the cause of the Great Depression, but the factors that had led to the Great Depression were already in place, and then Smoot-Hawley came into effect, which did what?
Well, exactly. That is right. What Smoot-Hawley seems to have done, I mean, many economists, I mean, again, as you pointed out, economists always, very, very much are two-handed, on the one hand, on the other hand. But you will find a fair number of economists would agree that while it didn't cause the Great Depression, it certainly seems to have accentuated its effects. And there is much greater agreement on that point than whether Smoot-Hawley actually caused the Great Depression. Certainly it didn't help. And again, as I pointed out, there's a fair amount of literature that suggests that actually it may have prolonged and deepened the effects of Great Depression.
So, we talk about tariffs, and then the other term that's bandied about is a trade war. So at what point do these individual tariffs escalate to the point where they can credibly be called a trade war? I mean, what makes it a war versus a tariff?
Well, right. So if I impose, so here's I think there's a great example actually. So in our recent negotiations, so it seems that the U.S.-Mexico agreement was one which began with our threat of tariff and ended up with an agreement. And so that was kind of the end of it. Whereas if Mexico had the economic might that China does and was going to say, nope, I'm not going to agree with what you're telling me. I'm going to impose tariffs on your products, which China has done. And then we're going to do the tit for that. And if that actually goes through, then we are talking about a trade war. The problem with the trade war is that by creating enormous tension among economies, it really begins to erode the very basis of international economic cooperation, and thereby creates actually a greater strategic threat than putting tariff, even if there are strategic industries that we're thinking about. So in other words, the strategic threat might actually work the other way, rather than in terms of tariff on particular strategic industry, if there are some.
So, and that's a very good point. I mean, at what point does what is essentially an economic dispute spill over and become a political one?
At the point where I think in economics we do have a tool for the answer to that question that's really known as game theory. In game theory, what's interesting is that it's basically a theory, and people probably remember the movie The Beautiful Mind. John Nash actor played the role of John Nash, his economics professor from Princeton. But the idea of a game theory is that people negotiate, and this negotiation may be adversarial, as in the case of tariffs. And at some point, while both parties realize that if their negotiating position would be cooperative, they would both gain, they end up in a negotiating position that we know as prisoner's dilemma, where they both lose. That is where tariff war really actualizes, if you will.
So we're seeing some of that. I mean, look at China. I mean, there's some issues now that in the South China Sea, where a U.S. naval vessel was denied access, where previously it would have been allowed through. And we've seen just recently Donald Trump suggesting that it's the Chinese, in fact, who are meddling in the upcoming election. I mean, do you think that's related to all of this?
So it is. I mean, there is nothing to say that if I'm negotiating with you, I'm going to keep my negotiations in the realm of economics only. Why wouldn't I expand my? Why wouldn't that spill over to my negotiating with you on the level on other aspects, military and strategic and so on. So in some sense, it makes sense that we are now seeing what we're seeing. Again, hopefully a lot of this is not parties are going to eventually back away from this, realizing that they're going to both be in a worse position than they started from, but perhaps they won't. And this is what game theory tells us. Under certain circumstances, parties will just continue to go down the wrong path.
So we've got just about a minute left, so that you are back in your office tomorrow and the phone rings and it's the White House and they said, okay, we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner here. What should we do? What advice would you offer the administration?
I would offer advice that the advice that many other economists have given the administration. One of the advices is that with respect to China, while they have abused certain things, one of the greater areas of abuse is not really tariffs, is not really trade per se, but it's the technology transfer. I would tighten the technology transfer avenue with China much more so than I would work on the trade agreements. And I think the trade agreements are good where they are. It's the technology transfer that many companies complain about in terms of the Chinese taking our technologies without really paying us our dues. So I think that would.
Well, let's wait and see if the phone rings tomorrow. Hamid Mohtadi, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
And to our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.